The ink on the marriage contract was barely dry when Alina first understood that she had traded one form of invisibility for another. She had stood at the altar of a cold, echoing chapel in the heart of London, her hand trembling only slightly as the Duke of Ashworth slid a heavy, ancestral ring onto her finger. He had not looked at her face. His eyes had been fixed on some point above the stained-glass window, as if the transaction being conducted was of no more consequence than the signing of a shipping manifest. The air had smelled of old stone and wilting lilies, and Alina had felt the collective, pitying gaze of the 200 guests boring into her back. She was the merchant's daughter, the necessary sacrifice, the bag of gold dressed in ivory silk. It was not a secret. Her father's fortune would shore up the crumbling Ashworth estate, and in return she would receive a title and a lifetime of cold duty. She had known this. She had agreed to it, but knowing the terms of a prison does little to warm the cell. Outside the chapel, the November wind had bitten through her velvet cloak, and the waiting carriage had been a black cavern of silence. Her new husband, Alexander, the Duke of Ashworth, had sat across from her, his long legs stretched before him, his expression carved from granite. She had studied him then, as she had been taught to study ledgers and men. He was handsome in the way a winter landscape is beautiful, harsh, remote, and utterly indifferent to her existence. His dark hair was touched with a trace of silver at the temples. His jaw was a sharp, unforgiving line, and his eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, had not once settled on her. "Your belongings will be sent ahead to Ashworth House," he had said, his voice low and even. "We will reside there for the winter. The servants will see to your comfort." It was not a question, nor an invitation. It was a decree. "Thank you, Your Grace," Alina had whispered, the words feeling brittle in her mouth. He had turned his head then, a slow, deliberate movement, and for the first time his gaze had touched her. It was a brief, clinical assessment, like a general surveying a newly acquired outpost. "You will find Ashworth House to be a quiet place," he had continued. "I do not entertain often. I trust you will not find the solitude burdensome." Alina had swallowed, her fingers tightening around the small, worn book of poems her mother had given her before she died. "I am accustomed to quiet, Your Grace." A faint, almost imperceptible flicker had crossed his features, irritation perhaps, or simply boredom. "It is not your duty to be accustomed, Duchess. It is your duty to be present." He had turned back to the window, the passing cityscape sliding over his features. "I will require nothing more of you." The words had landed with the finality of a closing door. "Nothing more of you." Alina had felt the heat of shame rise in her chest, a familiar companion. All her life she had been a ledger entry, a line of credit, a practical arrangement. She had no expectations of love. Her parents' marriage had been a business partnership, and they had shared a quiet, undemonstrative respect. But even they had taken their meals together. Even they had spoken of the day's small events. This man, this stranger she had just married, had already dismissed her as if she were a chair he had ordered, and would now forget in an empty room. As the carriage rolled through the grand, soot-stained streets of London, she had made a silent vow. She would be dutiful. She would be dignified. She would not grovel for the affection of a man who looked at her as if she were a drafty window. But even as she vowed it, a deep, cold ache had settled into her bones, a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. The journey to Ashworth House had taken 4 days. 4 days of silent inns, of meals eaten in separate rooms, of her husband's back retreating from her down drafty corridors. He rode ahead on horseback for much of the day, his great black stallion cutting through the gray landscape, leaving Alina alone in the rattling carriage with her maid and her thoughts. She watched the world change outside the window, the crowded, chaotic energy of London giving way to the rolling, desolate beauty of the countryside. The hills were the color of old bronze, the trees stripped bare by the approaching winter, and the sky was a pale, endless wash of gray. Each night at the inns, the Duke would bid her a formal good night. Each morning he would bow over her hand, his lips never quite touching her glove. She began to read his moods in the subtle shift of his shoulders, the deepening of the lines around his mouth. He was not cruel. That, she thought, would almost have been easier. Cruelty was a fire you could learn to avoid. His indifference was a fog, cold and damp, seeping into every corner of her spirit until she thought she might go mad from the silence. On the third evening, at a coaching inn on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, she had accidentally come upon him in the small, private parlor the inn had set aside for them. He was standing by the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, his cravat loosened. He looked tired, the sharp angles of his face softened by the firelight, and for a moment he seemed not like a duke, not like a cold stranger, but like a man carrying a heavy burden. He had heard the rustle of her gown and turned, his mask instantly back in place. "Duchess, is something amiss?" "No, your grace," she had said, her voice steady despite the frantic thrumming of her heart. "I was merely seeking a book. The innkeeper mentioned a small library." He had waved a hand toward a shadowed corner. "There is a collection of sermons and outdated almanacs, hardly worth the effort." "I find any book a comfort," she had replied, and immediately regretted the admission. It was too personal, too revealing. He had held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Comfort," he had repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "A rare commodity." She had not known how to respond. The fire had crackled, the silence stretching into an eternity. Finally, he had turned back to the flames. "Good night, Duchess." She had been dismissed, again. She had retreated to her cold room, her heart a dull, aching thud in her chest. She had lain awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was to be the sum total of her existence. A series of elegant dismissals, a lifetime of doors closing softly in her face. The thought was unbearable, and yet she had no idea how to change it. She did not know how to reach a man who had no desire to be reached. When the carriage finally turned through the towering iron gates of Ashworth House, Eleanor had felt a chill of foreboding. The estate was vast, a sprawling stone edifice that seemed to grow out of the moor itself, its hundreds of windows glinting like blind eyes in the weak November sun. It was not a warm place. It was a monument to duty, to lineage, to the crushing weight of history. And it was, she realized with a sinking heart, to be her home. The staff had lined up in the great hall to greet them, a sea of starched uniforms and carefully neutral faces. Eleanor had walked the length of them, murmuring polite greetings, memorizing names and positions with the ease of long practice. Her mother had taught her well. A lady must know the machinery of her household. But as she moved through the endless, echoing rooms of her new home, she felt not like a mistress, but like a ghost haunting a life that did not belong to her. Her husband had vanished almost immediately, claiming pressing estate business. Eleanor had been left in the care of the housekeeper, Mrs. Dill, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes. "His Grace has prepared the north wing for you, your Grace," she had said, her voice carefully neutral. "The rooms are most agreeable." The north wing, separate from the Duke, a long drafty gallery of empty rooms that would be hers alone. Eleanor had followed Mrs. Dill through the silent corridors, the air growing colder with every step. The room she was given was beautiful, in a cold, formal way, tapestries of faded silk, furniture of dark, polished wood, a vast bed draped in heavy velvet. But the windows faced the moors, a relentless view of brown and gray that offered no warmth, no comfort. That night she had sat alone at a dinner table long enough to seat 40, the food growing cold on her plate. The Duke had sent word that he was detained and would dine in his study. She had eaten a few bites of poached fish, the taste like ash in her mouth. The silence of the house was suffocating, broken only by the tick of a distant clock and the moan of the wind against the glass. She had retired to her room, dismissed her maid, and stood for a long time at the window, looking out at the darkness. The tears she had refused to shed on her wedding day, refused to shed on the long journey north, finally came then, hot and silent, streaming down her cheeks. She wept for her father, who loved her as a business asset. She wept for her mother, whose grave she had not visited in 3 years. She wept for the girl she had once been, who had believed, foolishly, that love might one day find her. And when the tears were spent, she had turned from the window, her jaw set, her eyes raw. She would not break. She would not become a ghost in her own life. She would learn this house, this land, this cold, silent husband. She would find her place, even if she had to carve it from the stone with her bare hands. But as she climbed into the vast, cold bed, a single thought echoed in the silence, a hook of fear and despair catching in her heart. What if he never allows it? What if the door he has closed is sealed for good? The thought lingered, poison-sweet, as the wind howled outside, and Alina pulled the covers to her chin, feeling utterly, devastatingly alone. The first weeks at Ashworth House were a masterclass in solitude. Alina learned the rhythm of the estate as one might learn a foreign language, slowly and with great concentration. She rose early, walked the long, tapestry-lined galleries, and took her breakfast alone in a sunless morning room. The Duke was a spectre, glimpsed occasionally on horseback, his dark figure cutting across the distant hills, or heard through the thick walls of his study, his voice a low murmur as he met with his steward. He took all his meals separately. He never sought her out. He seemed, for all intents and purposes, to have forgotten she existed. Alina filled her days with the small, necessary tasks of a great house. She reviewed the household accounts with Mrs. Dill, learning the names of every tenant farmer, every servant, every supplier. She visited the kitchens, the still-room, the greenhouses, determined to understand the complex organism of the estate she was now responsible for. The servants were polite, but distant. They watched her with wary eyes, uncertain what to make of this quiet, observant bride who asked so many questions and made so few demands. She discovered that the estate, for all its grandeur, was indeed in dire straits. The ledgers, which she had requested and been given with some reluctance, told a story of decades of decline. Land had been sold, investments had soured, and the grand house itself was in desperate need of repairs. Her father's money had stopped the bleeding, but it had not cured the disease. The Duke, she realized, was not merely cold. He was a man fighting a losing battle for the very soul of his family's legacy. The burden she had imagined on his shoulders was real, a crushing weight of history and obligation. This knowledge did not excuse his coldness, but it softened her resentment, replacing it with a complex, aching understanding. He had married her for her money, yes, but he had also married her to save the people who depended on him. It was a noble, desperate act, and she was the instrument of his salvation. The thought was not a comfort, but it was a truth she could hold on to. One gray afternoon, driven by a restlessness she could no longer contain, Alina found herself in the great library. It was a two-story room, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of paper, dust, and old leather, a scent she found deeply comforting. She trailed her fingers along the spines, reading the gold-embossed titles, histories, philosophies, collections of poetry, scientific treatises. It was a magnificent collection, but it had the air of a room long neglected, a museum to a past that no longer had a future. She climbed the spiral staircase to the upper gallery, seeking a secluded corner where she might lose herself for an hour. At the end of a narrow aisle, she found a small reading nook, a window seat overlooking the formal gardens. She curled up on the cushion, a volume of Wordsworth in her lap, and let the silence wash over her. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a semblance of peace. She was so absorbed in the poems that she did not hear the footsteps until they were directly behind her. She started, the book slipping from her fingers, and turned to find her husband standing in the aisle, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace," she breathed, her hand flying to her chest. "I did not hear you." "I was not aware the library was in use," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet space. "I apologize for disturbing you." "You did not disturb me," she said quickly. "I was merely taking advantage of the collection. It is extraordinary." He took a step closer, his gaze falling to the fallen book. "Wordsworth," he said, a note of something surprise perhaps in his voice. "You enjoy the romantics." Alina flushed, feeling strangely exposed. "I find their longing comforting," she admitted. The idea that beauty can be found even in the midst of melancholy. He picked up the book, his fingers brushing the worn cover. A sentimental notion, he said, but his tone was not dismissive. It was almost contemplative. I did not take you for a romantic, Duchess. There is much you do not know of me, Your Grace, she said, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. For a long, charged moment they simply looked at each other, and then something shifted in his expression. The hard, distant mask cracked just slightly, revealing a flicker of genuine curiosity. "No," he said slowly, "I suppose there is." He handed the book back to her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a spark of electricity in the cold, dusty air. "I will leave you to your reading," he said, and turned to go. Elinor watched him retreat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was the longest conversation they had had since their wedding day. It was nothing, a few polite words, but it felt like a door creaking open in a house she had thought sealed shut. The effect of that brief encounter was immediate and disorienting. The Duke did not suddenly become attentive. He did not seek her out at meals, but Elinor noticed a change in the atmosphere. He seemed more present, less like a ghost. She would catch him watching her across the room when he thought she was not looking. His gaze was no longer clinical, but assessing, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Once, during a formal dinner with his steward and a local magistrate, she made a quiet observation about a point of agricultural policy, and he had looked at her with such sharp, focused interest that she had forgotten what she was going to say next. The house, too, seemed to respond to her efforts. The servants, sensing her competence and her genuine care for the estate, began to thaw. Mrs. Dill, in particular, became a reluctant ally, offering small pieces of information about the household, the tenants, and the Duke's habits. Elinor learned that he had been much beloved by his late mother, that his father had been a cold, distant man, that he carried the weight of the dukedom with a grim, unyielding determination. The picture that emerged was of a man who had never been taught how to feel, only how to endure. A week after the library encounter, a letter arrived for Elinor from her father. It was a brief, businesslike missive, confirming the transfer of the final portion of her dowry. It contained no personal news, no expressions of affection. It ended with a reminder that she must comport herself in a manner befitting her new station. Elinor read it in the morning room, the thin paper trembling in her hand. The coldness of it, the complete absence of any filial warmth, was a wound she had long learned to ignore. But now, in the echoing silence of Ashworth House, it ached anew. She was folding the letter, her eyes stinging, when the Duke entered the room. He stopped short, seeing her face. "Elinor," he said, using her given name for the first time. "What is it? Has something happened?" The sound of her name on his lips undid her. A single tear, treacherous and hot, slipped down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, furious with herself. "It is nothing, Your Grace," she said, her voice thick. "A letter from my father. It is of no consequence." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood before her, his tall frame casting a shadow. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently took the letter from her grasp. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "He writes to you as a clerk to a debtor," he said, his voice low and hard. "It is unacceptable." Elinor laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "It is what it has always been, Your Grace. I am a transaction. You, of all people, know that." The words hung in the air between them, brutal and undeniable. The Duke's face went pale. For a moment he looked stricken, as if she had struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. The silence stretched, agonizing and profound. Elinor felt a surge of panic. She had gone too far. She had shattered the fragile truce they had built. "I apologize," she whispered. "That was uncalled for. I am simply tired." He moved then so quickly she barely had time to react. He took her hands in his grip firm and warm. His eyes, usually so distant, were fixed on hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "You are not a transaction, Elinor," he said, his voice a raw, rough whisper. "You are my wife." The words should have been a comfort, but the way he said them with such desperate, pained intensity only confused her more. Was it a declaration or a reminder of the inescapable cage they had both entered? She did not know. She only knew that his hands were warm, that he was looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and that her heart was cracking open in her chest. He held her hands for a long moment, his thumbs tracing the delicate bones of her wrists. Then, abruptly, he released her, stepping back. His mask was back in place, but his eyes were still burning. "I will speak to you later," he said, and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Alina stood alone in the morning room, her hands still warm from his touch, her mind reeling. He had called her by her name. He had taken her hands. He had called her his wife. But the pain in his eyes had been so raw, so overwhelming. What was he fighting? What was he so afraid of? The questions circled in her mind, an endless, dizzying dance. And beneath them all, a new, terrifying emotion was beginning to bloom, a fragile, desperate hope. She quickly crushed it down. Hope, she had learned, was the most dangerous of all emotions. It was a flame that could warm you, but it could also burn you to the ground. The days after the letter began to take on a new, unfamiliar texture. The Duke did not suddenly become a devoted husband, but his absence felt less like a void and more like a pause. He began to take some of his meals with her, their conversations carefully polite but no longer strained. He asked her opinion on matters of the estate, listening with genuine attention as she outlined her ideas for improving the tenant cottages and modernizing the home farm. She discovered he had a sharp, analytical mind and a dry, unexpected wit that emerged when he let his guard down. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the small sitting room she had begun to favor, he handed her a glass of sherry and settled into the chair opposite. The firelight danced over his features, softening the harsh lines of his face. For the first time, he looked almost relaxed. "I owe you an apology, Alina," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the flames. She looked at him, surprised. "For what, Your Grace?" He let out a slow breath. "For my behavior after our wedding, for the journey north, for the silence." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "It was not intended as a slight. I am unaccustomed to company. I have been told I am ill-suited to society." Alina cradled the warm glass in her hands. "I did not take it as a slight, Your Grace," she said, though it was not entirely true. "I understood that this marriage was not of your choosing. I did not expect warmth." "Did you not?" he asked, his voice low. "What did you expect?" She considered the question. "I expected duty," she said finally, "and quiet and the dignity of a position." She paused. "I did not expect to be seen." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze intent on her face. "And now," he asked, "what do you expect now?" The question was a challenge, a test. Alina felt her heart begin to race. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "I am learning that expectations are often the source of our greatest unhappiness. I am trying to learn to simply be." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "A difficult lesson for anyone," he said. "I suspect you are better at it than I." The conversation felt like a thaw, a slow cracking of ice. They talked late into the night about books and history, about the challenges of the estate, about the wild beauty of the moors. He told her about his childhood, about a father who had been as cold and unforgiving as the Yorkshire winters, about a mother who had died too young. He spoke of the dukedom as a burden, a chain of obligation that had been wrapped around his neck at birth. Alina listened, not with pity but with a quiet, steady attention that seemed to draw him out. In return, she told him about her own childhood, about a mother who had taught her to love poetry and music, about a father who had seen her only as an asset. She spoke of her loneliness, not as a complaint but as a simple fact. For the first time, they were not a duke and a duchess. They were simply two people, sharing the weight of their separate sorrows. The deepening connection between them did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Dill began to serve meals with a small, approving smile. The other servants, too, seemed to relax in Aliner's presence. The great house, once so cold and forbidding, began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. But with the thaw came new dangers. The first snow of winter arrived in late November, blanketing the moors in a thick, silent white. The house was snowed in for 3 days, the world outside reduced to a swirling white blur. Forced into constant proximity, Aliner and the Duke spent the days exploring the library together, playing chess by the fire and walking the long galleries. It was on the second day of the snow, as they stood before a large window watching the blizzard rage, that he reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was different from his previous touch. It was not a comfort nor an apology. It was a claiming. His fingers laced through hers, his grip warm and firm. Aliner's breath caught in her throat. "I am glad you are here, Aliner," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "I am glad you are not alone in this house." She looked up at him, her heart hammering. "As am I, Alexander," she whispered, using his name for the first time. He turned to face her, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. His eyes searched hers, and in their depths she saw a storm of emotions, longing, fear, and a desperate, aching need that echoed her own. "I do not know how to do this," he confessed, his voice rough. "I have spent my entire life learning to feel nothing, and you have." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I have what?" she prompted, her voice trembling. "You have made it impossible," he finished. He leaned down, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to kiss her. Her eyes fluttered closed, her breath suspended. But his lips did not meet hers. Instead, he pressed a single, feather-like kiss to her forehead, a gesture of such tender restraint that it made her want to weep. Then he pulled away, his hand dropping from her cheek, leaving a cold, aching patch in its wake. "We should dine," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. "The cook has prepared a stew." Aliner nodded, not trusting her voice. She followed him to the dining room, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and longing. He had almost kissed her. He had called her name, had held her hand, had touched her face as if she were something precious. But he had stopped. Why had he stopped? The question tormented her, a tiny hook of doubt lodged deep in her heart. The next morning the snow had stopped, but the world remained buried. Aliner woke to find a small velvet box on her bedside table. She opened it with trembling fingers to find a delicate silver locket, beautifully crafted, with a tiny, perfect snowdrop etched on the front. Inside was a miniature portrait, so small and exquisitely painted that she had to hold it to the light to see it clearly. It was a portrait of her. She sat in bed, the locket cold in her palm, her eyes filling with tears. It was the first gift he had ever given her. It was not jewels, not silks, not the grand gestures a duke might bestow upon his duchess. It was a private, personal treasure, a token of being seen. She clasped it around her neck, the cold metal warming against her skin. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, something real was growing between them. Perhaps the ice was not merely thawing. Perhaps it was giving way to spring. But the world outside the frosted windows of Ashworth House was not so easily held at bay, and the fragile flower of her hope was soon to be tested by a force far more threatening than any winter storm. The thaw continued through the heart of winter. By the time the first green shoots of spring began to push through the melting snow, Aliner had begun to feel, for the first time in her life, that she belonged. The household staff, led by the now devoted Mrs. Dill, had fully accepted her. She had implemented a series of reforms that improved the lives of the tenant farmers, and word of the new Duchess of Ashworth's kindness and intelligence had begun to spread through the county. The Duke, Alexander, had become a constant, quiet presence by her side. They still did not share a bed, a fact that caused Aliner a secret, aching pang, but their days were spent in each other's company, their conversations deepening into true intimacy. She learned his moods, his gestures, the subtle ways he showed affection. He would bring her books he thought she would enjoy, leaving them on her windowsill without a word. He would ensure the fire in her study was always lit before she entered. He would listen to her opinions on estate matters with a respect that still surprised her. And he looked at her now, truly looked at her, with a warmth in his gray eyes that made her pulse quicken. But with the spring came the return of society. Invitations that had been ignored during the winter months began to arrive, requests for the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth to attend dinners, balls, and house parties. Alexander was reluctant. He preferred the solitude of Ashworth House, but Alina knew that a duke could not hide forever. The estate needed allies, needed political capital, needed the social connections that had been neglected for so long. She gently persuaded him to accept a few carefully chosen invitations. The first event was a dinner party at the home of Sir Reginald and Lady Whitmore, wealthy landowners whose estate bordered Ashworth land. Alina dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the reddish highlights in her dark hair. Her maid had arranged her hair in an elegant chignon, leaving soft tendrils framing her face. She fastened the snowdrop locket around her neck, a small, private talisman. When she descended the staircase, Alexander was waiting for her in the great hall, looking devastatingly handsome in his formal evening clothes. His eyes widened slightly as she approached, and a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. "You are beautiful, Alina," he said, his voice low and sincere. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you, Alexander." He offered her his arm and she took it. As they walked to the carriage, she felt a surge of quiet confidence. For the first time, she was attending a social event as the Duchess of Ashworth, not as a rich merchant's daughter, not as a pariah, but as a woman of substance and worth. The dinner party was a disaster. From the moment they entered the Whitmores' grand salon, Alina felt the weight of curious, hostile stares. The women, in their silks and jewels, looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. The men, with few exceptions, either ignored her or looked at her with a speculative gleam that made her skin crawl. The whispers began almost immediately, a low, buzzing undercurrent that followed her through the room. "That is her, the tradesman's daughter. Bought the title, they say. The Duke must be utterly desperate. A fortune for a fortune, hardly a love match." Alina's spine stiffened. She had heard such whispers all her life, but tonight they seemed sharper, more vicious. She clung to Alexander's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. He seemed oblivious to the whispers, or perhaps he simply did not care. He led her through the crowd, his expression cool and aloof. The dinner itself was a trial. Alina was seated beside Lord Whitmore, a pompous, florid man who spent the entire meal lecturing her on the proper management of an estate, completely ignoring her quiet, well-informed contributions. Across the table, the ladies whispered behind their fans, their eyes darting to Alina with malicious glee. The conversation was a minefield of veiled insults and subtle barbs. "And how do you find life in the North, Duchess?" asked Lady Whitmore, her voice dripping with honey. "It must be quite a change from London society." "I find it very beautiful," Alina replied evenly. "The landscape is breathtaking." "Ah, yes," Lady Whitmore said with a thin smile. "The moors, so very rustic. One imagines it can be quite isolating. But then I suppose you are accustomed to a certain solitude." The implication was clear. Alina felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to be baited. "I am blessed with a very fine library and a husband whose company I greatly enjoy," she said, her voice steady. "I am never lonely." A ripple of surprise went around the table. Alexander, seated at the far end, looked up and caught her eye. Something unreadable flickered in his gaze. Pride, perhaps, or gratitude. The moment passed, but the attacks continued. At one point, a young, arrogant baronet named Lord Henry Carlisle, who had been drinking too much, leaned across the table and addressed Alina with a sneer. "Tell me, Duchess," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard by all, "is it true that your father made his fortune in shipping? I find it fascinating how such practical concerns can now purchase a coronet." A stunned silence fell over the table. Alina's blood ran cold. It was the crudest possible insult, a public humiliation designed to put her in her place. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She felt the weight of every eye on her, the malicious satisfaction of the women, the embarrassment of the men. And then Alexander spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the full weight of his authority. "Lord Carlisle," he said, his eyes cold as winter steel, "you will apologize to my wife. Immediately." Carlisle laughed, a nervous, brittle sound. "I meant no offense, Your Grace, merely an observation." "It is not an observation," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It is an insult, and I do not tolerate insults to the Duchess of Ashworth. Apologize, or I will demand satisfaction." The room held its breath. The threat of a duel hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Carlyle's face went pale. He glanced around the table, seeking support, but found none. The Duke of Ashworth's reputation as a cold, formidable man was well known. No one doubted he would follow through. I apologize, Duchess," Carlyle stammered, his voice barely audible. "It was a foolish remark. I meant no disrespect." Eleanor inclined her head, her heart pounding. "Thank you, Lord Carlisle," she said, her voice cool and composed, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The dinner resumed, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Eleanor could feel Alexander's anger radiating from across the table. He did not look at her, but his jaw was set, his knuckles white against the tablecloth. When the ladies retired to the drawing-room, leaving the men to their port, Eleanor was immediately surrounded by a flock of women, their curiosity now laced with a new, sharper edge. "How romantic," cooed one woman, whose name Eleanor could not remember. "The Duke defending your honor. One would almost think it a love match." "Indeed," another chimed in. "But then one hears such strange things. The Duke is known to be so very cold. Are you quite sure he is not merely protecting his investment?" The words were delivered with sweet smiles, but they were daggers, each one aimed at the most vulnerable part of Eleanor's heart. She felt the fragile hope she had nurtured all winter begin to wither under their assault. She made her excuses as quickly as she could, claiming a headache, and retreated to a quiet corner of the room. The lace at her sleeve suddenly felt too tight, the air too close. The words echoed in her mind, protecting his investment. Was that all she was to him, even now? A possession to be defended, not a woman to be loved. When the carriage finally came to carry them home, Eleanor climbed in and sat in silence, staring out the window at the dark, passing landscape. Alexander sat opposite her, his own silence heavy and fraught. He did not speak until they were halfway back to Ashworth House. "Eleanor," he said, his voice strained, "I am sorry. I should not have brought you there. I should have known how they would behave." She did not turn to look at him. "You defended me," she said, her voice flat. "I am grateful." "I would do it again," he said, a fierce edge to his voice. "I will always defend you." "But is that all?" The words escaped her before she could stop them, a raw, desperate whisper. "Am I merely a possession to be defended, an investment to be protected?" The silence in the carriage was so complete she could hear the beat of her own heart. She finally turned to look at him. His face was a mask of shock, his eyes wide and wounded. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "Is that what you truly think of me, Eleanor?" "I do not know what to think," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I hear their words and I see your actions, and I do not know which to believe. You are kind to me in private, but in public you are a stranger. You touch me with tenderness, but you never, she trailed off, the words she truly wanted to say trapped in her throat. "I never what?" he demanded, leaning forward, his eyes burning into hers. "You never let me in," she whispered. "Not truly. You give me pieces of yourself, but you hold back the rest. You kiss my forehead as if I were a child. You call me your wife, but you keep me at arm's length. Tell me, Alexander, what am I to you, truly?" The question hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. The carriage rocked gently as it turned onto the long drive leading to Ashworth House. Alexander stared at her, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. For a long, agonizing moment, she thought he would not answer. She thought he would retreat back behind his walls, and the fragile bridge between them would crumble into ruin. Then he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "You are the only thing that has ever made me feel," he said, the words torn from him, "and it terrifies me." The carriage rolled to a stop before the great doors. A footman moved to open the door, but Alexander's hand shot out, holding it shut. He leaned across the small space, his face inches from hers. "I'm not good at this, Alina," he said, his breath warm against her cheek. "I'm not good at softness or pretty words or letting anyone see the chaos inside me, but you are not an investment. You are not a possession. You are—" He stopped, his hand coming up to brush a stray curl from her cheek. "You are the only warmth I have ever known." He did not wait for her response. He opened the door and climbed out, turning to offer her his hand. She took it, her entire body trembling. As they walked up the stone steps to their home, the weight of his words settled over her, a heavy, terrifying, beautiful burden. He had not said he loved her, but he had given her something far more fragile, his fear. And in that moment, Alina understood that she was in grave danger of losing her heart completely to a man who was still learning how to use his own. Spring deepened into summer, and the memory of the disastrous dinner party began to fade. The social invitation ceased, which was a relief to them both. They retreated back into the private world of Ashworth House, but the equilibrium between them had shifted. Alexander's confession in the carriage had opened a door, and while he did not suddenly become a verbose romantic, his affection became more tangible. He sought her out constantly, his hand finding the small of her back as they walked, his gaze lingering on her with a warmth that made her stomach flutter. He began to leave her notes, small, cryptic lines of poetry tucked into books or left on her breakfast tray. Alina, in turn, began to shed the last of her emotional armor. She stopped measuring her words, stopped anticipating his withdrawal. She laughed more freely, teased him gently, and allowed herself to simply enjoy his company. The great, cold house was now filled with the quiet music of their shared lives, the murmur of their voices in the library, the crackle of the fire in their sitting room, the soft rustle of her skirts as she worked beside him in the garden. It was, she thought, a kind of happiness she had never dared to imagine. But there was one shadow that lingered between them, the unspoken question of their marriage bed. They had never discussed it. They slept in separate wings, and while their days were filled with a growing intimacy, the nights remained a chasm. Alina ached for him. She longed to be held, to feel the full measure of his passion, to cross that final, terrifying threshold. But she did not know how to ask. She was afraid of rejection, afraid of shattering the delicate peace they had built. And she sensed that Alexander was afraid too, afraid of what such intimacy would require of him, of the vulnerability it would expose. The tension was a constant undercurrent, a low hum of desire and fear that colored every glance, every accidental touch. One afternoon, caught in a sudden summer rainstorm while walking the grounds, they had taken shelter in the old boathouse by the lake. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wood and lake water. They stood close together, their clothes damp, their breath mingling in the small space. Alexander had pushed a wet strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. His eyes were dark, intense, full of a longing that stole her breath. "Alina," he had murmured, his voice husky. She had leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Yes." He had hesitated, his other hand coming up to cup her face, tilting her head back. She could feel the heat of his body, the tension in his muscles. She knew in that moment that he was going to kiss her. Not a chaste kiss on the forehead, but a real kiss, a claiming. But then a loud crack of thunder had shaken the boathouse, and he had flinched, stepping back. The moment shattered. He had apologized, a pained expression on his face, and they had walked back to the house in silence, the rain soaking them through. The near miss left Alina aching and confused. His restraint felt less like respect and more like a wall she could not scale. The next day, a visitor arrived at Ashworth House, Lady Caroline Finchley. She was the widow of a baron, a beautiful, elegant woman with honey-colored hair and a calculating gleam in her green eyes. She was, Alina learned, an old friend of the Duke's family. She had come to spend a few weeks in the country to escape the heat of London. From the moment Lady Caroline arrived, Alina felt a chill of unease. The woman was everything Alina was not: polished, witty, effortlessly at ease in the world of the ton. She was also, quite obviously, still deeply interested in Alexander. She touched his arm when she spoke to him, laughed too brightly at his dry remarks, and looked at Alina with a faint, patronizing smile that set Alina's teeth on edge. Alexander seemed oblivious to Lady Caroline's attentions. He treated her with the same distant courtesy he showed all his guests. But Alina could not shake the feeling that Caroline saw her as an obstacle. The woman's presence was a constant reminder of the world Alina had left behind, a world of sophisticated women who knew how to play the game, women who would never be caught off guard by a thunderstorm or reduced to tears by a cold letter. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room after dinner, Caroline steered the conversation toward the past. She spoke of her late husband with a practiced sigh, then turned to Alexander with a nostalgic smile. "Do you remember, Alexander, the summer we spent at your family's estate in Scotland?" she asked, her voice soft and intimate. "We were so young. We thought we would live forever." Alexander's expression was carefully neutral. "I remember," he said shortly. "It was the summer before you went to university," Caroline continued, her eyes fixed on him. "You promised to write to me every day. You broke that promise, I recall." A flicker of something, irritation perhaps, crossed Alexander's face. "I was young and foolish," he said. "I apologize for any disappointment I caused." Caroline laughed, a low, musical sound. "Oh, I forgave you long ago, my dear. I could never stay angry with you." She turned to Alina, her smile widening. "Men are such creatures of habit, are they not, Duchess? They make promises so easily, and yet they seem incapable of keeping them." Alina felt the barb hidden in the polite words. She smiled, a thin, tight smile. "I have found my husband to be a man of his word," she said, her voice cool. "Perhaps it is a matter of finding the right woman to hold him to them." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Caroline's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "How fortunate for you," she said, her voice laced with insincerity. "You must tell me your secret." The evening ended shortly after. Alina excused herself, claiming a headache, and retreated to her room. She stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit garden, her heart heavy. Caroline's presence was a poison, seeping into the cracks of her fragile confidence. The woman's intimate knowledge of Alexander's past, her easy familiarity, her unspoken claim, it all made Alina feel like an outsider in her own home. She was the interloper, the transaction, the woman who had bought her way into a world that would never truly accept her. The doubt that had been banished by a winter of quiet intimacy came roaring back, a dark, suffocating wave. What did she truly know of Alexander's heart? He had given her pieces of himself, yes, but there was so much he still held back. What did she know of his past loves, his youthful promises, the women who had known him before the weight of the dukedom had crushed his spirit? Caroline Finchley was a walking, talking reminder of all that Alina did not know, of all the history she could never share. As she stood in the darkness, a new, sharper emotion began to take root: jealousy. It was ugly and poisonous, but she could not deny it. She was jealous of Caroline's history, of her elegance, of the easy familiarity that seemed to come so naturally to her. And beneath the jealousy, a deeper fear was growing, a fear that she, Alina, would never be enough, that she would always be the outsider looking in. The thought was a hook, sharp and cold, lodging itself in her heart. What if in the end all her quiet strength, all her patient understanding, was not enough to compete with a past she could never be a part of? What if she was not the first woman he had let in, but merely the most convenient? The fear was unbearable, and it kept her awake long into the night, listening to the distant, mocking laughter of Lady Caroline Finchley echoing through the halls of her mind. The next few days were a slow, agonizing exercise in self-control. Alina watched as Caroline wove her subtle web around Alexander, her every gesture and word designed to remind him of a shared past, of an easier, lighter time before the burdens of the dukedom. She would arrange impromptu picnics, suggest walks to familiar spots on the estate, and steer every conversation toward memories of their youth. Alexander, for his part, remained courteous but distant, yet Alina could not shake the feeling that a part of him was being drawn back into that past. He would sometimes get a faraway look in his eyes when Caroline spoke, a flicker of nostalgia that cut Alina to the quick. Alina tried to remain gracious, to rise above the pettiness of jealousy. She fulfilled her duties as hostess, ensured Caroline's comfort, and maintained a composed facade. But inside, she was crumbling. The quiet confidence she had built over the months was being eroded, day by Caroline's subtle barbs and Alexander's apparent blindness to them. The breaking point came on a bright, sun-drenched afternoon. Alina had retreated to the library, seeking refuge among the books that had always been her solace. She was curled in her favorite window seat, a volume of Shakespeare open on her lap, when she heard voices in the garden below. Looking out, she saw Alexander and Caroline walking along the path that led to the lake. Caroline's arm was linked through his, her head tilted toward him as she spoke, her laughter floating up on the breeze. They looked, Alina thought with a sickening lurch in her stomach, like a couple, a comfortable, familiar, beautiful couple. She watched them until they disappeared around a bend in the path, then closed her book, her hands trembling. She could not do this anymore. She could not sit idly by and watch as her husband was courted by another woman under her own roof. She was not naive. She had seen the way Caroline looked at him, the way she touched him. It was not innocent nostalgia. It was a campaign. That evening, Alina pleaded a headache and took dinner in her room. She could not bear the thought of another meal spent watching Caroline's performance, watching Alexander's polite but distracted responses. She sat alone in her room, the untouched food growing cold on its tray, and cried. The tears were hot and bitter, a release of all the tension and fear she had been holding inside. She had been so foolish. She had allowed herself to believe that she could build a life here, that she could be loved. But she was just a placeholder, a stopgap measure to save an estate. And now that the estate was saved, perhaps Alexander had no further use for her. Perhaps he would be happy to be rid of her, to return to the arms of a woman who truly belonged in his world. The thought was a knife through her heart. She wept until she had no more tears, then sat in the darkness, her body shaking with exhaustion. It was in this state, her face streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, that Alexander found her. He had opened her door without knocking, a breach of etiquette that spoke of his own agitation. He stopped short when he saw her, his expression shifting from frustration to alarm. "Alina," he said, his voice sharp with concern. "What has happened? Are you ill?" She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "I am tired," she said, her voice flat. "Please, Alexander, just leave me be." He ignored her, crossing the room to kneel before her chair. He reached out to touch her face, but she flinched away. The gesture hit him like a physical blow. His hand dropped, his jaw tightening. "Tell me what is wrong," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is not like you." "You do not know what is like me," she said bitterly. "You do not know me at all. You know a version of me that is convenient, that asks no questions, that makes no demands. You do not know the woman who is watching her husband be seduced by another woman and is expected to smile and play the gracious hostess." The words hung in the air, raw and accusing. Alexander's face went pale. "Seduced?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. "Alina, what are you talking about? Caroline is an old friend, nothing more." "Is she?" Alina challenged, her voice rising. "Have you not seen the way she looks at you, the way she touches you? She is not acting like a friend, Alexander. She is acting like a woman who wants you back. And you," her voice broke, "you let her, you laugh with her, you walk with her. You let her cling to your arm as if she has a claim on you." Alexander stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. "You are jealous," he said slowly, as if the concept were utterly foreign to him. "Yes," Elinor cried, the word tearing from her throat. "I am jealous. I am jealous of her history with you, of her ease, of the way she belongs to your world in a way I never will. I am jealous of every moment you spend with her, every memory she has that I can never share. I am jealous because I am your wife, Alexander, and I am tired of feeling like an outsider in my own home, in my own marriage." She was on her feet now, her chest heaving, her heart pounding. The words had poured out of her, a torrent of pent-up emotion that she could no longer contain. She had exposed her deepest fears, her ugliest insecurities, and she waited for his response, her body trembling. For a long, agonizing moment, Alexander simply looked at her. His expression was a mask of shock and something else, something that looked almost like pain. Then slowly he rose to his feet. He did not speak. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and took her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, but his grip was firm, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Elinor," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "listen to me. Caroline Finchley is nothing to me. She is a relic of a past I have no desire to revisit. I did not ask her here. I did not invite her. And I have not, for one single moment, looked at her as anything other than a tedious guest whose departure I am eagerly anticipating." Elinor shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I saw you. You seemed so comfortable with her." "I am not comfortable with her," he said, his voice hardening. "I am polite to her because she is a guest in my home, and because I was taught, above all else, to be polite. But her presence here is an irritation, not a pleasure. Can you not see that? Can you not see that the only woman in this house who occupies my thoughts, my every waking moment, is you?" Elinor's breath hitched. Her heart was racing, her mind reeling. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide and raw, full of a desperate honesty that took her breath away. "Then why?" she whispered, the question trembling on her lips. "Why do you hold me at arm's length? Why do you stop yourself every time we get close? Why do you make me feel like I am trying to climb a wall that has no top?" He closed his eyes, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. His breath was warm against her lips, his hands still cupping her face. "Because I am afraid," he confessed, the words barely audible. "I am afraid of the depth of what I feel for you. I am afraid that if I let myself go, if I truly let you in, I will be consumed by it. And I am afraid of losing you, of being left alone with the ruin of that feeling. It is easier to hold back. It is safer. But I am beginning to understand that it is also destroying us." He opened his eyes, pulling back just enough to look at her. The raw, unfiltered emotion in his gaze was like a physical force, pressing against her, demanding a response. "I am not good at this, Elinor," he said. "I have told you that, but I am trying. And I need you to be patient with me. I need you to believe that when I look at you, when I touch you, it is real. It is not a game or a duty or a strategy. It is the most terrifying, beautiful, overwhelming thing I have ever experienced." Elinor's tears continued to fall, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of release, of a hope so fierce it hurt. She reached up, her hands covering his, her fingers lacing through his. "I believe you," she whispered. "I am sorry I doubted you. I am sorry I let my fear and jealousy get the better of me." He shook his head. "Do not apologize. You had every right to be upset. I should have been more aware. I should have seen how Caroline's presence was affecting you. I should have put a stop to it sooner." He stroked her cheek with his thumb, wiping away a tear. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice soft. "We are both learning, I think." He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his harsh features into something breathtakingly beautiful. "Then perhaps we can learn together," he said. He leaned in, and this time he did not hesitate. He kissed her. It was not a chaste kiss on the forehead. It was a kiss of claiming, of passion, of all the pent-up longing that had been simmering between them for months. His lips were warm and soft, moving against hers with a hunger that stole her breath. She melted into him, her arms sliding around his neck, her body pressing against the solid warmth of his. The world outside the room ceased to exist. There was only this, only him, only the incredible, terrifying, beautiful reality of his mouth on hers. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his arms still wrapped tightly around her. "No more separate rooms," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "No more walls. I want you with me, Alina, always." She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes," she whispered, "always." In that moment, all the doubt, all the jealousy, all the fear that had plagued her for weeks dissolved. She was not an outsider. She was not a transaction. She was his, and he was hers. The realization was a balm to her wounded heart, a healing warmth that spread through her entire being. But even as she surrendered to the joy of the moment, a small, lingering voice in the back of her mind wondered, could it last? Or was this just another thaw, another temporary spring before a longer, colder winter? She pushed the thought away, choosing for once to simply be happy. She had earned this moment. She would not let fear steal it from her. The days that followed were a revelation. The shift between them was seismic, a profound unburdening that changed the very texture of their lives. Alina did not return to the North Wing. Instead, she found herself in the Duke's chambers, a room she had never entered before. It was warmer, more personal than the rest of the house, filled with his books, his maps, the scent of leather and sandalwood. Their conversations, once confined to drawing rooms and libraries, now continued late into the night, whispered in the dark, their bodies intertwined. The intimacy between them deepened in ways Alina had only read about in the poetry she loved. She learned the language of his silences, the meaning behind the tightening of his jaw, the softening of his eyes. She discovered that his reserve was not coldness, but a deep, abiding vulnerability, a fear of exposing a heart that had been broken too many times. And she, in turn, allowed herself to be truly vulnerable, to let him see the insecurities she had hidden for so long. Alexander, for his part, seemed to come alive. The hard, distant mask he had worn for the world began to slip away, replaced by a quiet warmth that was all the more moving for its rarity. He still presented a formidable face to the world, but in her presence, he was tender, playful, and devastatingly attentive. He would bring her tea in the mornings, read to her by the fire in the evenings, and steal kisses in the most unexpected moments, in the hallways, in the garden, once even behind a stack of dusty ledgers in his study. Lady Caroline, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, made her departure within the week. Her farewell was frosty, her eyes sharp with a barely concealed resentment. Alina, filled with a new, quiet confidence, met her gaze without flinching. She bid the woman a polite farewell, feeling only a vast, expanding relief as the carriage finally rolled away down the drive. The shadow was gone. The house and the man were hers. Summer gave way to autumn, and the moors were painted in hues of gold and russet. Alina felt her roots sinking deep into the Yorkshire soil. She was no longer a merchant's daughter playing at being a duchess. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, loved and cherished, a partner in every sense of the word. The tenants adored her, the servants respected her, and her husband, her quiet, formidable husband, looked at her with an adoration that made her feel like the most powerful woman in England. One crisp October afternoon, Alina received a letter from her father. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest as she broke the seal, but the contents were not what she expected. He wrote of his declining health, of his desire to see her, of a man's late-blooming regret for a life spent chasing ledgers instead of love. He wrote that he was proud of her. The words, so long withheld, brought tears to her eyes. It was not an absolution, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a seed of healing. She shared the letter with Alexander that evening, reading it aloud to him by the fire. He listened in silence, his hand resting on her knee. When she finished, he took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Will you go to him?" he asked. Alina considered the question. The journey to London was long and arduous, and her relationship with her father was complicated. But she knew in her heart that she must go. She had spent her entire life seeking his approval, and now, at the end of his life, she needed to find a way to forgive him. For her own sake, not his. "I think I must," she said. "Will you come with me?" He smiled, a slow, tender smile. "I would follow you anywhere, Alina," he said. "You know that." They left for London the following week. The journey, which had once been a trial of silence and coldness, was now a pleasure. They talked, laughed, and shared the small intimacies of travel. Alexander pointed out landmarks, told her stories of his misspent youth in the city, and held her hand as the carriage rattled over the rough roads. It was, Alina thought, a perfect journey. Her father's London house was a grand, sterile mansion in Mayfair, a monument to his wealth and his emotional isolation. Alina had grown up within its walls, but it had never felt like home. Walking through the echoing halls now, she felt a strange detachment. The house was smaller than she remembered, the rooms darker. It was a place of ghosts. Her father was waiting for her in his study, a frail figure in a vast leather chair. He had aged dramatically in the months since she had last seen him. His face was gaunt, his hands trembling, but his eyes, when they met hers, were clear. He reached out a hand, and Alina took it, feeling the fragile bones beneath the papery skin. "My girl," he whispered, his voice a shadow of its former strength. "You look well." "I am well, father," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am happy." He nodded, his eyes drifting to Alexander, who stood behind her. "Your Grace," he said, "thank you for bringing her, and for," he paused, swallowing hard, "for being a better man than I was." Alexander stepped forward, his expression serious. "Your daughter has brought me great happiness, sir," he said. "I have no doubt that she brings the same to you." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "She always did," he whispered. "I was simply too blind to see it." The days that followed were bittersweet. Alina sat with her father for hours, reading to him, talking to him, listening to his halting confessions. He spoke of her mother, of the love he had been too afraid to show. He spoke of his regrets, his loneliness, his pride. Alina listened, her heart aching for the man he had been and the man he was becoming. She did not offer false comfort. She simply held his hand and let him speak. It was a gift she had learned from Alexander, the power of silent, non-judgmental presence. One evening, as the autumn light faded from the sky, her father's breathing grew shallower. The doctor was summoned, but it was clear that the end was near. Alina sat by his bedside, holding his hand. Alexander stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a steady, anchoring weight. Her father opened his eyes, his gaze finding hers. "Alina," he whispered, "I love you. I have always loved you. I was just too afraid to say it." The tears streamed down Alina's face. She squeezed his hand. "I know, father," she said. "I love you too." A faint smile touched his lips. Then his eyes closed and his hand went slack. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the distant sound of London traffic. Alina sat for a long time, holding her father's hand, feeling the warmth slowly fade from his fingers. The grief was a deep, cold ache, but beneath it was a sense of peace. She had made her peace with him. She had found closure, and she had done it with Alexander by her side. After the funeral, they returned to Yorkshire. The journey was quieter, more subdued. Alina spent much of the time looking out the window, lost in thought. Alexander held her hand, his thumb stroking slow circles on her skin. He did not try to fill the silence with words. He simply let her be. As the carriage turned through the gates of Ashworth House, Alina felt a sense of homecoming so profound it took her breath away. This was her home, not the cold, echoing mausoleum she had first entered, but a place of warmth, of love, of belonging. The house seemed to welcome her back, its stone walls glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. That night, as they lay in their bed, Alina turned to Alexander. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting silver shadows across his face. He was watching her, his expression tender. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being with me, for everything." He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. "There is nowhere else I would ever be," he said. She curled into his side, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. She felt safe. She felt loved. She felt, for the first time in her life, truly whole. The shadows of her past had been banished, replaced by a light that warmed her from the inside out. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks she slept without dreaming. She was home. She was finally, irrevocably home. The first year of their marriage drew to a close, and Alina looked back on the journey with a sense of quiet wonder. She had arrived at Ashworth House as a stranger, a transaction, a woman terrified of being invisible. Now she stood on the threshold of a new year, transformed. The grief of her father's passing had faded to a gentle ache, a reminder of the love that had been salvaged from the wreckage of her childhood. The estate was thriving, the tenants prosperous, and the grand house, once so cold and forbidding, now hummed with the quiet music of a contented home. The transformation in Alexander was equally remarkable. The man who had once confessed to feeling nothing now felt everything, and he was no longer afraid to show it. He still wore his public mask of reserve, but in private he was warm, playful, and devoted. He courted her still, bringing her gifts of books and wildflowers, leaving her notes, stealing kisses in the hallways. He was not perfect. He still retreated into silence when troubled, still struggled to articulate the depths of his emotions. But he tried, and that was all Alina had ever asked. The most profound change, however, was not in their circumstances, but in the nature of their love. It had begun as a fragile shoot, struggling to survive in the cold, hard ground of duty and obligation. It had weathered storms of doubt, jealousy, and fear. It had been nourished by patience, understanding, and a willingness to be vulnerable. And now it had blossomed into something strong and enduring, a love that was not blind to flaws, but embraced them as part of the whole. On a crisp, clear evening in late December, they stood together on the terrace of Ashworth House, looking out over the moonlit moors. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of snow and the distant sea. The house behind them was ablaze with light, the sounds of music and laughter spilling out into the night. They were hosting their first Christmas gathering, a small party of tenants and local gentry, a celebration of the year's blessings and the promise of the year to come. Alina leaned against Alexander, his arm wrapped around her, his body a solid wall of warmth against the chill. She could hear the faint strains of a violin, the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses. It was a good sound, a sound of community, of belonging. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked, his voice a low murmur against her hair. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands resting on his chest. She looked up at the face she had come to know so well, the sharp lines softened by the moonlight, the gray eyes warm and full of love. "I am," she said, her voice sincere. "Are you?" He considered the question, his gaze serious. "I am learning," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It is an unfamiliar sensation." She laughed softly. "I think you are doing a very fine job of it, Your Grace." He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "I have had an excellent teacher," he whispered. The moment was perfect, a crystalline instant of joy and contentment. But even as she basked in its warmth, Alina felt a stirring of something else, a restlessness that was not dissatisfaction but anticipation. She had built a life here, a good life. But she knew with a sudden, clarifying certainty that there was more to come. The story was not over. It was just beginning. "Alexander," she said, pulling back slightly to look at him, "I want to ask you something." He raised an eyebrow. "And what is that, my love?" She took a deep breath, her heart beginning to race. It was a question she had been pondering for weeks, ever since they had returned from London. It was a question that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "When we were first married," she began, her voice careful, "you told me you would require nothing more of me than my presence. Do you remember?" His expression grew serious. "I remember," he said quietly. "I was a fool." She shook her head. "No, you were honest. You were a man who had built walls so high he could no longer see over them." She paused, gathering her courage. "Those walls are gone now, Alexander. We have torn them down together, and I have come to understand that I no longer wish to simply be present in your life. I want more." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "More," he repeated, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "What do you mean?" Elinor smiled, a slow, radiant smile that seemed to light up the darkness around them. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I want a family, Alexander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to give you a child. I want to fill this house with the sound of laughter, the pitter-patter of small feet. I want to build something that will outlast us both." He stared at her, his hand resting on her stomach, his face a mask of shock. For a long moment he did not speak. Elinor's heart hammered in her chest, a frantic rhythm of hope and fear. What if he was not ready? What if the thought of a child, of the responsibility, of the vulnerability, was too much for him? And then slowly his expression began to change. The shock gave way to a dawning wonder, and the wonder to a joy so pure, so overwhelming that it stole her breath. His eyes filled with tears, a sight she had rarely seen. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe. "Elinor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Elinor, my love, my life." He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling. "I never dared to hope, I never thought I deserved." She held him, her own tears flowing freely. "You deserve it all, Alexander," she said. "We deserve it. We have earned it." He pulled back, his hands cupping her face, his eyes shining with tears and joy. "You have given me everything," he said, his voice rough. "You have given me a home, a purpose, a reason to feel, and now you are giving me a family." He shook his head as if he could not quite believe it. "I love you, Elinor. I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life." The words, spoken with such raw, unguarded sincerity, were like a sunrise after a long, dark night. Elinor felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst. She had waited so long to hear those words, had feared she would never hear them from him. And now, standing on the terrace of their home, with the stars wheeling overhead and the music of their friends drifting out into the night, he had given them to her. Freely. Completely. "I love you too, Alexander," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I have loved you for so long." He kissed her then, a kiss that was not about passion but about promise. It was a kiss of gratitude, of adoration, of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. It was a kiss that spoke of the future, of the child growing in her womb, of the long, beautiful life they would build together. When they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. The music from the house had stopped, and the guests had gathered at the windows, watching them with quiet approval. Elinor saw Mrs. Dill in the doorway, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw the tenants, their faces warm with affection. She saw the faces of people whose lives she had touched, and who had touched hers in return. She took Alexander's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Come," she said, tilting her head toward the house. "We should return to our guests. We have an announcement to make." He smiled, a smile so wide, so genuine that it transformed his face. "Indeed we do," he said. They walked back into the house together, hand in hand, and the crowd parted to let them pass. Elinor felt the warmth of their gazes, the weight of their good wishes. She was no longer the invisible woman, the transaction, the outsider. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, beloved wife, mistress of a thriving estate, and soon a mother. The realization filled her with a quiet, profound sense of peace. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into a contented silence, Elinor stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall. The flakes drifted down in a gentle, silent dance, blanketing the moors in a soft white shroud. The world outside was hushed and still, a canvas of white and silver. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She leaned back against him, her hands covering his. "I am thinking about how strange life is," she said. "A year ago, I stood at a window just like this, looking out at a world that felt cold and empty. I was so lonely, so afraid. I did not know how I would survive this marriage." He pressed a kiss to her temple. And now, she said, turning in his arms to face him, "I cannot imagine a life without you. You have filled every empty space in my heart, Alexander. You have made me believe that I am worthy of love." His eyes softened and he cupped her face in his hands. "You are not just worthy of love, Alina," he said. "You are love. You are the very essence of it, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you how very much you are loved." She smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That sounds like a very long time," she said. He smiled back, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Not nearly long enough," he whispered. "Not nearly long enough." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that tasted of snow and forever. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a peaceful silence, Alina Ashworth, the merchant's daughter who had married a cold, distant duke, stood in the warm embrace of the man she loved and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had finally, truly come home. The journey had been long, and the road had been hard, but the destination was more beautiful than anything she could have ever imagined. And their story, their real story, was only just beginning.